Welcome back to Out of Possession. And today on Out of Possession, we're actually talking about things that happen out of possession for once. We're talking about pressing, and we're going to do a deep dive into how it's changed over time, primarily this season, primarily looking at Manchester City. And who better to discuss this with than the Athletic's very own out of possession expert, Jon Mackenzie.
Hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good, mate. And just maybe for the people that I'm sure everyone's aware of your work, because you're much more high up in the world of football tactics than I am, but just for maybe the people that aren't, do you want to tell them what you do and where you feature?
Yeah, like you said, I work for The Athletic. I work for the video department as a tactical analyst in particular, and I do a lot of podcasting and visual presentations, particularly on YouTube, but a lot of our stuff goes out on social media as well. And yeah, we attempt to try and make the world of tactics a little bit more understandable for everyday fans, which is a good fun job because there's a lot going on in football at the moment, and it's my pleasure to try and get to the bottom of that and try and help other people understand that too.
I'm having a bit of a fanboy moment at the moment because The Athletic was the first thing. In fact, it wasn't The Athletic at that point. It was Tifo Football, and that was kind of what got me into the more tactical side of football and probably the main inspiration for me to start this channel. So you definitely succeed at what you do. And is it fair to say that your favourite aspect of football is the pressing stuff and the out of possession stuff?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I sort of have become pigeonholed as someone who talks about this side of the game in particular. But I don't know. I don't know whether or not I particularly think of myself as someone who is primarily an out of possession fan. I do think that the out of possession aspects of the game are probably the most influential on the modern history and evolution of tactics. And I think for me that was a big realization that I made early on in my tactical journey. Fortunately for me, I'm a Leeds fan, and we got the opportunity to watch Leeds under Marcelo Bielsa. So that was really what kick-started me going especially deeper in tactics. And as you'll know, Marcelo Bielsa uses a very unusual out-of-possession approach. And I guess through the process of trying to understand what he was trying to do without the ball, I got to a point where I realized that very few people were actually talking about it. And so I was like, well, fine, I'll do it myself. And I kind of got quite into the out of possession aspect through him. And yeah, I guess I would recommend anyone who wants to get into the world of tactics to have a coach like that, who they start off with, who they can do their first kind of deep dive forays into the world of football tactics through. And I think for that reason, I've always had that then interest whenever I've looked at any other coaches in the out of possession side of the game. And I guess I was lucky really in that Bielsa uses a predominantly man-to-man focused out of possession approach. And the way that the modern game has moved is towards adopting man-to-man principles a lot more than they did after the Arrigo Sacchi consensus that emerged at the end of the 80s, where everyone was moving towards zonal structures. A big thing that I talk about a lot is the shift towards hybrid pressing, which is trying to get the best of both worlds between zonal and man systems. And I think you can trace all of the stuff that I've done in that respect back to those early forays into Marcelo Bielsa's football as well. So yeah, I mean, I do have a special interest in the out of possession side of things. I think that was primarily maybe catalyzed by the fact that very few people were doing that at the time. But I've been very lucky in that it's become quite important. But I was thinking about this the other day. This is very much the case that pressing as an aesthetic quality is quite underrated. I don't think it's as nice as when people do things with the ball, but I think there's something really, I think, enjoyable about watching a collective press where all of the players do everything right and they come out achieving the ends of what they set out to do. And I was watching PSG versus Chelsea back. I managed to get hold of the tactical camera footage for that. And just watching the press, just how well coordinated they are. PSG are incredible to watch in and out of possession. But for me, I think some of the collective stuff that they do out of possession is as attractive as the stuff they do collectively with their rotations and stuff on the ball too. So, maybe I'm a bit further gone than most people when it comes to describing themselves as a fan of out of possession. But I say we bring back making it okay to think that out of possession, the out of possession side of the game is attractive and well worth enjoying as a fan.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think we've seen it with Semenyo quite recently. Is that, do you maybe think the barriers to entry of understanding what makes a good press and what makes a bad press is just so much higher than what makes a good player in possession and out of possession? Because anyone can watch a football match. For example, they can watch Ryan Cherky get on the ball and play a fantastic Rabona cross or whatever and go, oh, that's amazing, he's very good. Whereas I don't think anyone could watch a football match and say, oh, this team's a really good pressing because they're going man-to-man here, and this team's bad at pressing because maybe they're missing their jumps or whatever. And I think maybe that's why the out of possession side of the game is not talked about as much as the in possession side of the game, just because it's less accessible. And if you're wanting to reach an audience, the best place to be able to put your content in is a position where it can reach the most people as possible, right? And out of possession stuff simply doesn't do that, which leads to more conversations about in possession, which brings me back to Semenyo, because for me, Semenyo's best quality and the reason why all these top clubs wanted to sign him is because, as well as being a great goal scorer and relatively decent on the ball, he is like this fantastic presser. He's really intelligent when he does it. He's really athletic when he does it. Yet that point was barely mentioned around the transfer saga when he came into Manchester City. And it's something that, like, I did a video about it, and all the comments on that video are, oh, game's gone, people are thinking about pressing and running. And it's like, well, I see the point, but I think it's really, really important, and arguably more important than what happens on the ball.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the teams who've done well in recent years have all been amongst the best out of possession teams in the world. When City were at their best, back in 22-23, I think they were the best out of possession team in the world. From that period onwards, Arsenal probably been the best out of possession team in the world. And yeah, okay, they've had their issues with some of the in possession stuff, but they've still been up and about the top level for 5 years now under Arteta. PSG, even like a team that you wouldn't think of as being necessarily made out to be a good out of possession side, and you look at some of the, I guess, more diminutive players in their midfield, you might not think of them as being a good out of possession side, but João Neves is a cheat code off the ball. And again, the collective man-to-man stuff that they do is ridiculously good. So yeah, agreed. I mean, there's a lot you've said there that we need to dig into, but when I was talking about PSG before, I made it very clear to distinguish the out of possession aspect as a collective aspect against the in possession collective aspect. Whereas I think what a lot of people really enjoy about football is the individual aspect, right? Which is much easier to appreciate. And, we watch, largely speaking, what's happening with the ball and what the players are doing with the ball. And I think it's much easier to draw the line of inference from what a player is doing immediately on the ball to that being good or bad, right? You can watch someone, as you say, like Ryan Cherky, probably one of the best on-ball players in the world right now. It doesn't take me as an analyst to explain to people why what he's doing is really good. You can go deeper. There's more people doing biomechanic explanations of what's going on. I always find them a little bit too indirect, maybe. But the long and short of it is that when a player does something good, it doesn't matter what you know about football, really. You can tell that that's a good thing. There's some things, that maybe people don't have as much of an appreciation for. But, if someone does a trick, goes around a player, it's very easy for you to understand what's going on. And then I think the next level is, trying to understand what teams are trying to do collectively with the ball, around the ball in particular. And then from there, maybe the hardest thing to do is to understand what's happening off the ball too. But yeah, there's different things that you can appreciate about that. As I said before, it's the collective aspect that I think is so important with pressing, because if you don't all get it right, it goes wrong. And that makes it, I would argue, more high stakes than anything else that's happening on a football pitch, even to the extent that, everyone doesn't have to do everything correctly collectively in possession for you to generate chances and goals. It's very rare that if you don't get everything right in the modern game out of possession, that you won't get punished for it. So, yeah, I would agree with that. And then on your point on Semenyo, absolutely. Again, I remember making a short soon after when he was being linked to Manchester City, being like, why might a club like Manchester City be going for someone like Semenyo, because he doesn't really fit the kind of profile of players that they've usually gone for. It's interesting because you did sort of soften your language about how good he is on the ball, which I appreciated, because I think it's easy for people to say, well, this is a guy who's good out of possession, he's scoring lots of goals, therefore he's good in possession. But it's been interesting for me watching him at City, just because he's been good for them as a bagsman, right? He's got into dangerous positions and scored. He's done the out of possession stuff, but sometimes in terms of the in possession stuff, he can have negative impacts, I think, on what City are trying to do with the ball. In part, I think a lot of this is contextualized by, the tactical landscape shifting. And no doubt we'll get on to talk about that. But in many respects, he's doing the things that he needs to do. He doesn't have to be good at everything. In that respect, it's maybe easier to think of him as almost a striker, right? Where the skill set of what he needs to be elite at is maybe a little bit narrower. But yeah, interesting to hear your thoughts on that, because I guess I always had these sort of slight misgivings about how well he would fit into what City were doing. But some of those misgivings, and maybe I see them playing out on the pitch. But he scored so many goals and been so fundamentally useful as a producer that it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think my viewpoint's probably quite similar to yours. In fact, when we signed him, I was very on the fence, probably slightly leaning more to the negative side of the fence of, oh, we shouldn't sign this guy. Now I think I'm slightly positive. I just think the way he's used, you have to get it spot on. And if you don't get it spot on, he has a real negative effect, because obviously he scores great goals. He's a fantastic box crasher. And people see that, and you see how quickly the narrative changes in a game where maybe he doesn't score the goals. For example, Real Madrid, I don't know if you watched the game on Wednesday, but he was playing in this kind of as a 10 almost, because we didn't have Ryan Cherki on the pitch. Doku was our only creator, and Doku got shut down in 2v1s, 3v1s within about 20 minutes of the game. So now you've got a situation where Semenyo's receiving the ball in the pockets because they've only got 3 in the midfield line, and obviously those gaps are quite big. But when he's receiving it, he's got a clunky touch. He's not really creating anything with it. And then you get issues, right? And the narrative becomes, oh, Semenyo's really, really poor. And we see this blow hot and cold really consistently. He'll score a goal. Semenyo is the best thing since sliced bread. He has a game where he doesn't score a goal, and it's likely in that game he barely did anything. Semenyo's awful. There's not really a middle ground with him. And I think that's because, again, people don't see that he's amazing at pressing, and this is the value he brings. It's Ryan Cherki is the absolute opposite of that. Is he's quite a poor presser, and that's the reason I think he doesn't start the majority of games. But people don't see that, so they want him starting every single game, when maybe that's not the best thing, especially when you're away at the Bernabeu. Like, to put Cherki in there is such risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on top of that, as we've already alluded to, there's been a shift in the tactical landscape. And I think a lot of people are now talking about the tactical landscape as being, it's all about being direct. It's about high intensity pressing. It's much less about ball control and defending with the ball. That's sort of true, I would say, but I would say that it's not the full truth. I think the full truth is that we're in a much more diverse tactical landscape than we've been in for a long time. There isn't that cheat code of if you can control the ball in and out of possession the way that City used to do under Guardiola for years and years and years, you're just going to dominate the landscape. Actually, it's a lot more, I like to describe it as like rock, paper, scissors tactics, where there's no team really who has the dominant tactic anymore. There's teams who are going to be playing scissors tactics that are going to lose to rocks, right? But they'll beat paper, etc. And you can cycle through the different iterations of that. And I think that's what's so interesting about a team like City, is that they have a team that was in the past optimized for very sort of high territory, high possession, like control football. And they're trying to shift to a landscape where actually, if you can play direct, it can make your life easier in some games. And so it sometimes feels as though they've got a squad that's a bit caught between their old paradigm and then the new paradigm, and that's the difficulty of it. And that's what I thought was interesting about the Real Madrid game, right? Is that you can make the argument that Guardiola went into that game expecting one paradigm, and perhaps a different paradigm might have suited better. I heard him speaking after the game suggesting that they went for a sort of more of an attack mentality than a control mentality, and clearly there was some issues with that in the game. So yeah, I think that's the reality of where we're at, right? It's not to say that we're going to get well-rounded Manchester City players anymore. It's that, in certain games a Semenyo might be more useful. In other games, a Shirky might be more useful. And almost the skill of the manager is being able to determine what kind of game is going to unfold and what starting 11 is required of those players. So yeah, I totally agree with you on all of that.
I think something that's really interesting that we're seeing at the moment is like how teams are building squads, because I think maybe 5 years ago you'd see, especially at Manchester City, at these top teams, you'd opt for quite like-for-like replacements. Whereas if you look at the Man City team now, we almost have no players that are like-for-like in the same position. You want guys that offer different things, so you can be tactically flexible. To go back to your like rock, paper, scissors kind of tactics, the idea is if you can be rock and scissors, you can kind of be anything. And you see it with Arsenal as well. They have these small technical players, but they also have these big physical giants. They can kind of play any type of football. And I think that adaptability is really valuable in the modern game.
Yeah, totally agree.
Look at like Real Madrid, for example. There's a really good quote from Guardiola where he's talking about what he was attempting to do in that game. And he said something like the idea was to have Semenyo and Nico O'Reilly follow the runners and then Bernardo and Rodri pick them up. And that worked, right? First 20 minutes, I thought we were quite good. And then Madrid just dropped Valverde back into that back line and made it a 5. And then he started playing as a winger. That pulls Nico O'Reilly out. And then you've got this Bernardo Silva pushing up to get the overload, and it just falls apart immediately. And I was really surprised that he didn't adapt, because you saw this happening. I was like, oh, it's okay. We've got these players on the bench, like Ryan Cherky, who he's going to bring on and change it straight away. And he didn't. He was quite stubborn, which I found surprising, because I think that's the value in having these different profiles of players, is you can change it like that and be adaptable. So I was surprised he was stubborn in his side.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mention the sorts of players that City are signing now, because that's a relatively recent phenomenon, right? That he started signing some of these more physical profiles. Even if you go back to the summer, Cherky was signed in the summer. All of the long conversations that were happening about Donnarumma, I suppose, were there in the summer as well. But the players that he brought in were not physically dominant specimens, right? We're talking like Tijani Reinders, not a player who's going to stodge out your midfield, right? And Ryan Aït-Nouri as well, I suppose, after all of the conversations we've had for the last few seasons about the width being provided by fullbacks and maybe that prompting City to sign slightly different fullback profiles. I would say that Aït-Nouri very much fits the sort of old style of a sort of very technical, can come inside if you need him to, small space technicality stuff, rather than a kind of long busting runner that you've ended up with, like with O'Reilly or Nunes on the other side. And then when you get to the January transfer window this time round, then you're signing players like Semenyo, you're signing players like Gehi, very different kinds of profile from maybe what you would have expected in the past. And I think it's fair to raise the question of like how much has Guardiola been surprised by this evolution in the landscape. And it's, on the one hand, it's important to say that part of the reason why Guardiola has had so much longevity is he is so quick to evolve when things change in the tactical landscape. But I think what's different this time is that previously, across the last 15 years, the evolutions that he's gone through have been within the paradigm that he's generally accepted, right? Which is what we talked about, this high territory dominance, high possession dominance, the ability to control games with and without the ball, defend without the ball. We're now shifting to a paradigm where that control is almost the enemy, right? And this paradigm has come out of the fact that if you try and play control football, Guardiola's going to win. That's what he's consistently done. And so we've got a breed of managers who've come through now and said, well, fine, we're not going to agree to play the game on his terms. We're going to try and make games more chaotic. And as a result, yes, they'll probably still beat us, fairly regularly, but it will. The quote that I always use is the Jurgen Klopp quote when he was at Dortmund, where he says, "When we play against Bayern, we try and pull them down to our level." That's very much what I think the new meta is. It's the teams in the mid-table trying to pull the teams at the top down to their level. The teams at the bottom trying to pull the mid-table teams down to their level. And so rather than allowing these control structures to emerge, and structure is an important word there, because I think structure is what has allowed teams to control games. What teams are trying to do now is prevent their opponents from getting into good structures, both from an in possession and out of possession point of view. And if you can do that, the game becomes chaotic. If you have players that are suited in more chaotic game states, then you're going to have more of an upside against a team maybe where control has been the watchword. So I do think that Guardiola has maybe been a bit surprised by this shift in the landscape. And the impression I get, and again, this is a narrative I've pushed for a while now, is that it's almost like he like last season, for example, when everything went wrong, and in the second half of the season they did this sort of 4-2-2 where they overload the middle. They were like, fine, we're getting absolutely munched through the middle because the squad's aged out. We don't have the players to cover those big spaces. We'll provide width with the fullbacks. That just seemed like a much more fruitful way for a team like City to play in the modern era. But then we get to this season, and it's almost like, we're going to try and go back to width providing wingers, and then the same old issues of like, we're going to leave the middle open too much. And it feels like we've gone backwards and forwards with Pep now for maybe a year and a half, between being like, this new style seems to work, but I don't like it. I want to go back to the old ways. And again, I'd be interested to hear from you as a City aficionado whether or not you would agree with that sort of reading of the history.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the important factor that maybe you've missed there is the fact that Guardiola was the guy evolving football before, and now maybe for the first time, or the first significant time, he's having to chase it.
Yeah,
and
I've
never really seen him do that before. Exactly. I think PSG, Luis Enrique kind of set the curve now with, everyone's man-to-man. How can we find the advantage here? We can use the fullbacks really hard to create the overload. And then we've seen almost everyone go out, panic a bit, go, we need to do this, we need to follow this, and bring in your attacking fullbacks. I think Aït-Nouri's of that kind of that profile, if you like. But if we go back and look at history, it's always been Guardiola making the tweaks. It was Guardiola switching to the four centre-backs, pushing John Stones up, for example. And then when everyone else eventually catch-ups and starts doing that, he's the guy then switching it out again to do what counters that. And for the first time in history, he's been outran almost. He's not leading the race anymore. And I think he's trying to deal with that, but he doesn't really know how to do it almost because he's never been in that situation before. And I think he's struggling, to be honest. Like you say, we see him fix things and then he doesn't like that fix. For example, at the start of the season, like you alluded to, you've got Doku inside the pocket, Cherki inside the pocket, and I think it worked really well. But the issue was with the transitions. If you're trying to play through the middle every time, we're losing the ball in the middle. It's then really, really easy to transition, and we conceded a lot of counter-attacking opportunities because of that. So I think now he's trying to shift out wide, because obviously if you lose the ball out wide, then it's much, much easier to press. But I think especially against the bigger sides, we're seeing him being almost cowardly in the press, in my opinion, in how many bodies we're willing to commit. And it's just causing us bigger problems, because then you get these massive spaces like we saw against Real Madrid in the middle of the pitch. There's no point attacking the wide areas because we can't press them in effectively there. And it's just leading to big, big issues. So I think we're going to see a breaking point maybe in the next few months, couple of weeks, where we see him either go one way and press really, really aggressively, or we're going to see us go back to that narrower shape and just accept that the transitions are going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting here you're talking about the shift to a more aggressive approach, because that's what we saw at the beginning of the season, right? Again, I think this is just a standard trope that you see whenever managers may be struggling a little bit from a tactical point of view. I feel as though there's very much a sort of fork in the road for the Guardiola approach in the last few seasons, and that is, you've got on the one hand Guardiola going one way, and then on the other hand, and you could maybe throw in like Hansi Flick in there as well. I probably wouldn't throw Luis Enrique in there because I feel as though there is differences between what he's doing, but he's obviously like someone who's been massively influenced by Guardiola, and he's on that side of the fork, I suppose, in terms of being like, you want to make up the difference by being aggressive and playing almost on the edge. And then obviously Arteta on the other side, right, where Arteta was like, the issue here is that if you play Pep Guardiola football, the gamble is always that you have to be able to defend the situations that you that you set up by your in possession approach, right? So if you're going to do high territorial dominance, if you're going to do high possession dominance, you're always leaving yourself at the risk of counterattacks, right? And in the last few years, teams have just got so much better at exploiting those, particularly in the Premier League, right, where the talent window is much higher. Every team now has players that can just kill you in those scenarios. And I think the way that Arteta responded to that was like, fine, we're going to still try and do that, but we're going to maximize our physical profiles. And we're going to fill the team with, incredible athletes in every position, really. And we're going to mitigate that through being really good from a defensive point of view. And obviously then that creates problems for your in possession side of the game, because maybe they've compromised on the technicality a little bit in certain situations. And they've managed to actually ride that storm, I would say, because despite the fact that you can see their open play XG just sort of dropping down over the last few seasons after they lost out in those few seasons before, when they were chasing City right to the end of the line. They were able to make up that difference through set pieces, right? Which is why set pieces have become so important. But I think on the other hand of that fork that in the road that I've talked about, you've got those coaches who still want to just load their teams with technical players. So Hansi Flick's like a great example of that. If you look at that Barcelona team, there's really not the kind of physically imposing dominance that you get in an Arsenal team, for example, which isn't to say that the players aren't athletic, because obviously they are. Almost everyone playing at that level has to be athletic, but not optimized towards a certain type of physicality, right? And the way that they have to deal with that is to take risks, right? They have to have a super high line. They have to play an offside trap, because they have to make the spaces in front of them small enough that they actually have good enough access, right? So that to me seems to be the fork in the road for this Guardiola approach. And at the beginning of this season, we very much saw it. You mentioned before we went on air the Brighton press, where it felt as though City were just like, fine, this is the last roll of the dice. We're going to see if we can just press as we usually press, but press even more aggressively, and maybe this will work for us. And those sorts of presses kind of do work to a large extent, because they're so aggressive that teams can get a little bit hit by them. So the Brighton game I thought was quite interesting, because City were fine for like 60 minutes until Brighton found a solve, and then you conceded like nearly 2 xg in the final 30 minutes. So albeit there was a penalty in there as well, but it was still a lot of chance creation for them in the last because they found out how to skew your press, right? And since then, I think that the City press has sort of lived in that space between trying to be aggressive, not being aggressive enough, trying to get the balance right. And you mentioned you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's the worst place to be, personally. Like in the no man's land, I think you've got to go one way or the other. Otherwise, you're going to get problems from not committing enough. I think Real Madrid's the best example of this, because we see this diamond press that we kind of play in, where you have the back four, who the fullbacks aren't going to be that aggressive. Then you have Rodri kind of by himself. You have the two wingers, for example, against Real Madrid, it was Savinho and Doku. Then you have a front three who are going to press quite aggressively. Against Real Madrid, it was Bernardo, Semenyo, and Erling Haaland. And the idea is you're going to try and force the ball wide and then press from there and go kind of man to man. But the problem is that these wide positions that Savinho and Doku had to play are just so physically demanding. The distances are massive. It's like you're going to get caught out, and ultimately the distances are massive, right? Because we're not willing to push the fullbacks forward, for example. Like if you watch Newcastle against Barcelona, Lewis Hall was constantly taking risks. He's constantly making that jump, and that allowed them to really squeeze Barcelona in. I thought they were fantastic, but we're not willing to take those risks. So it's why you see these massive spaces open up, because ultimately, if you give a team like Real Madrid, who are really, really good on the ball, if you give them a one-man, two-man overload in their first phase in build-up, they're going to play through you the majority of the time, no matter how good you are off the ball, how athletic you are. So I think you've either got to sit off more and accept, okay, we'll concede the territory and we'll have a really good block, or you've got to go really aggressive and go, we're going to win the ball back here. Going in this like middle ground, yes, it's okay. Maybe if you're playing a weaker opposition where they're not going to play through you every time if they have the overload, like we saw against Newcastle, for example. But as soon as you come up against these top teams, they're going to just cut through you easily. And we've seen that with Chelsea. We saw it when we played Liverpool in moments, and we saw it against Real Madrid. So I think if we want to compete against the best teams, something has to change with the press for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I would say that the evolution of hybrid pressing, which is what we're talking about, right? It's like shifting between that a sort of deeper zonal variety and then jumping into a man-to-man phase. It does contain within itself the possibility of shifting between levels of intensity, right? And I think you can make the argument that in recent seasons Arsenal have started being less aggressive in terms of the hybrid press, and I think it's precisely because of that, because I think these hybrid presses worked really well at first because teams were so unused to having to play against man around the ball that they start, they would panic, you'd win the ball back and generate chances from there, or just recycle possession. But what is almost always the case in a hybrid approach is that you are going to allow a weakness somewhere on the field, and there's a few things about that I think are important for coaching staffs. One of them is that these are sort of predictable weaknesses. So if a team presses one way, if you build up in a certain area, then the weakness will almost always open up on the other side of the pitch across maybe, and it depends what height that weakness will be. It might be the fullback, it might be in behind the opposition's midfield, but it will always open up in a certain way. And so you have like your training plan for the week sorted in build up, which is you're going to bait the opponents to press one side and then try and find the free player. And teams are good enough now to be able to do that fairly regularly and sustainably and consistently. And I guess that's what I find so interesting about the recent evolution, because I think so the first time we really see, like, I would say, conscious hybrid presses is 2020-21, where you get a form of it with Arteta and you get a form of it with Andoni Iraola. And I'm sure there's other coaches who are doing it around the same time, but those are the two that I focused on and saw it happening with at first. And both of those coaches did it in different ways. For Arteta, he was doing the fullback to fullback jump, right, which you've talked about, which is a very aggressive way of playing. And it's sort of quite easy to exploit. Actually, if you watch the PSG-Chelsea game from last week, you'll see PSG rotating players into very deep fullback positions. So often pushing Hakimi super high up the pitch, but then having maybe Warren Zaire-Emery dropping into the fullback zone and dropping very flat, so almost sometimes behind the line of the centre backs, because the larger that jump is, the harder it is for Cucurella to make it. And that's the difficulty of it, right? Is that when you are having a fullback to fullback jump, the opponent can just drop their fullback deeper and deeper and deeper, and the distances become too big, as you said. So that's what Arteta was originally doing. With Iraola, it was much more of these sort of central jumps where there's the midfield jump out and you have like your 10 jumps onto the centre back, and then the 8 covers the 10's player or the pivot player usually. And then, there's a number of different solutions for covering the other player that left behind. You have these like long chains of jumps where you're basically shifting the weakness as far away from the opponent on the ball as possible. But again, what you start seeing then is the ability for teams to open out spaces in front of the opposition's back four and then exploit them. So the goal against Arsenal, PSG, first leg of the semi-finals. Was it last year? No, the year before. I can't remember. Who won the Champions League
last year? PSG.
Yeah. So it was last season. I'm feeling my age. I think the more time must have elapsed than actually has. But in that first leg, in the semi-finals, because they beat Real Madrid in the quarterfinals, right?
Yes.
That goal that was scored was created by PSG manipulating Arsenal's press, creating space around Ousmane Dembele, and then Nuno Mendes being able to play those diagonal balls that he plays in behind that, into the space of that press. João Neves is pinning, I think it's Jakub Kiwior of all people at the centre back, and that just completely opens them out, right? So I think after that sort of period, a lot of hybrid pressing teams stopped allowing the weaknesses to open out around the midfield area, and they went back to that original one of saying, fine, we'll allow the weakness to open up in the wide area, we'll let teams play those wedge passes from the goalkeeper to the fullback, and even though it's very manipulable and they can often get around our press, it's still preferable to like allowing space to open out in front of your back line, right? So now what you see, I think, is and even if the fullback for the opponent gets the ball, your fullback is still in advance of them, right? So can catch up to them. And I think teams just much more willing to allow that to happen now. But yeah, I think with City, they do that. They do that wide weakness approach. But the way that they're doing it, as you said, is by playing this 4-4-2 diamond and then squeezing on one side. The idea is that the far side fullback will be the weakness. And the idea is that you squeeze them against the sideline and they shouldn't be able to access the opposite side fullback very easily, which is all well and good. And I think, it's quite an elegant solution on paper. The problem is that, like, you're seeing a City in the early stages of the season, you were seeing a City team where it was like Foden, Bernardo and Cherki maybe, or Doku, Foden and Cherki in that three. That is essentially, you've got a three against the opposition four. They're double pivot and they're two fullbacks, and you're saying when the ball's on one side we shift across, so three goes to three, far side fullback's free. If the ball goes to the other side, you do the opposite shift, right? So that's where you're allowing the weakness to exist. All well and good, but like, if you want to get creative players in that midfield three, it's going to be very hard for you to prevent those switches of play happening. And you'll know yourself that the amount of times where it feels as though City have been exposed at the back post because a team has gone aggressive and they've run out of players to defend, so everyone's jumped across and there's a free player at the back post. It's happened loads this season, and in part I think that comes from the fact that what you're actually doing is allowing that weakness to open out. And the amount of times where I've seen, Semenyo or Foden or Cherki, who's been technically playing on the far side as the winger, not catching their player up, and it just being a tap in at the back post has happened a lot as well. So, yeah, I kind of feel as though part of the issue here is that if Guardiola is going to want to play these kind of aggressive, demanding hybrid presses, he is going to have to compromise on the level of technicality he wants to get in the team too.
Yeah. I think we've seen that recently as well, right? I think since Semenyo's come in especially, we've moved Nico Riley up into a more midfield position. Yeah. And then instead of having, like we see at the start of the season, like you said, you'd have Foden, who's actually quite good at possession, to be fair to him, despite his size. But you'd have Foden and maybe Doku or Savinho in those really, really demanding wide points of the diamond roles, which are the make or break of the system, really, because the reality is we talk about shifting the weakness, but if you have weak personnel in the diamond, your weakness is in there as well as on the other side. So you need these physical players to be able to force the weakness to the other side. And we've seen it actually be quite effective, to be fair, with Semenyo in the wide role on the right, and then you have Nico Riley on the wide role in the left, and they're physical enough to be able to cover these big jumps, cover the ground to make it work. But the issue is, like, I keep coming back to Madrid, but against Madrid, Savinho is in there, and he can't make the jumps. And there's so many instances, I think the second goal's one of them, where he jumps on Mendy and then he's slightly too slow, which allows Mendy to get his head up, and then we're reluctant to push Kushnerov forward because he has to stay with Vinicius Jr. And then Real Madrid just have two players stood in the pocket because Bernardo can't shift quick enough, Rodri can't shift across quick enough because the space he's been asked to cover is ridiculous. And they can just easily play forward, and just like that, you're through on our back line. Like we say, the weakness was everywhere because we haven't been brave. And I think if you are braver and say, just let Diaz take Vinicius Jr., let Kushnerov squeeze up, then we'd have seen better results, actually, because in being scared of Vinicius Jr., you're actually letting Vinicius Jr. get the ball way more often than he would if you were just brave and pushed up instead. Then you'd win it back up here instead of allowing it to come all the way up the pitch and get to him.
I think Arsenal's a great counter example, right? When you think about Arsenal's diamond, they'll have Zubimendi at the base of the diamond doing, like, I guess, sort of more interception work, right? It's a little bit more of a zonal role, dropping into the back line. But then in front of that, you'll have maybe Martinelli on one side, Saka on the other, and Declan Rice playing in the 10 slot to cover, like, the opposition's double pivot or pivot, right? It's just different levels of, like, what you can expect from that particularly the three that we're talking about when it's those three versus as we said, Savinho, Doku, Cherki in there as well, and then you take into account the fact that they've got Martin Odegaard in the front line as well, who I just think is the best pressing 10 in the world. You add those things together, and it's it's no surprise that Arsenal can play the same basic structure as Man City, and yet here we are talking about Man City having a weak structure, right? When Arsenal can manage that all the same. Again, it's worth talking about intentions and strategy as well, because I think Arsenal are much more conservative than City when it comes to pressing, right? They'll be. I think that City still have that Guardiola mentality of, like, we need to have the ball all the time. Arsenal obviously now. And again, we can argue about whether or not Arsenal do this too much. I think they probably do, but they have the mentality that we don't need to have the ball because we're good enough without the ball to stop teams from being able to hurt us, right? And I think the City attitude is the opposite one, which is like, if we get broken in the press, we're gonna fall. So we have to be more aggressive. And I think that's what it comes down to, right? It's like, what are you actually worried about with your defensive structure? Is it having your press broken and having to deal with that, or is it actually having your players out of the way so that your second, third phases of defending are more consistent and structured? So yeah, I guess that's the difference between Man City and Arsenal as things stand.
Yeah, I think we can overcomplicate it sometimes as well. I think sometimes it does just come down to Arsenal have guys who are really, really good at pressing, and therefore kind of no matter the structure, they will be relatively successful, whereas we don't. So no matter what structure we're in, we're going to have more issues. It's like on the ball, for example, there's kind of like a high floor almost in terms of like maybe 5 years ago trying to play that Pep Guardiola style. Like you can't just control, copy and paste it across or whatever. For example, when Burnley came up, they tried to play very, very similar football to Guardiola. And Guardiola's winning the league, Burnley are getting relegated simply because Guardiola has way better players. Like that is the reality of it sometimes. And I think it's the same off the ball. Maybe this structure we're playing is too high floor and therefore it can be really successful for Arsenal, but maybe Manchester City and Guardiola should look to try and shift to something that is more conservative, is more safe, and a bit easier almost to compensate for the lack of out of possession quality we have in the team sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. And I think the issue here is that no football team is ever perfect, right? So what we're talking about is, oh, look, Arsenal are really good at this thing that they're optimized to be really good for, as if that's, a profound point. City are really good at what they're optimized to be good for, but that is not necessarily the out of possession side. It's the in possession side, right? And with City, I always get the impression that like the out of possession is always secondary to the in possession. The out of possession only ever has to be good enough to give a base from which the attack can work from, right? And the argument with Arsenal is that they get that maybe the wrong way around, right? That they prioritize the defense and then the attack is maybe a little bit more of an afterthought. And look at the last 15 years of European football history. I think it's pretty clear which of those tendencies is the more efficient one for winning a lot. And that is the one where you go out and you try and score more goals than the opposition, rather than the one where you try and reduce goals and get bitten on the arse by variance a little bit more. So yeah, it goes both ways. It is very much down to do with the players that you have, like you say. But Arsenal have prioritised very specific types of players. City have prioritised other types of players, and that's almost where the tactical. The conversation should go, really. It's like this is a decision about the players that you play, rather than like some kind of deeper tactical debate about what is better or worse.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing you say about maybe Arsenal getting it the wrong way around, I disagree, because I don't think we've ever seen a team that can consistently score from set pieces so effectively. And given the fact that Arsenal know, we'll score a goal from a corner maybe just, for example, once a game, even though it's less than that, but just as a base mark.
To be fair.
Yeah, but if we know we're going to score a corner, guaranteed, do we need to be fantastic in possession? Do you need to be prioritizing that, or should you prioritize defensive stability? Like, for example, Manchester City, there's no point us prioritizing our defense and playing in a way Arsenal do, because we can't guarantee that goal. Whereas if Arsenal know we're going to concede 2 goals very, very rarely, they're almost certainly going to get points, win the majority of games. You might have the odd draw just because they know their floor is so high, and that allows them to play in that way.
Yeah, and it's worth saying as well, there's overlaps here, right? That Arsenal knowing they can score from corners is boosted by the fact that they know that the players that make them good from corners are also the players that make them good defensively, right? So it all folds back on itself eventually.
In recent months as well with City, I think what we've seen is maybe us going against our principles, and in an attempt to try and become better out of possession and fix these issues, we've diminished our biggest strength, which is these in possession things. Our biggest strength is it's having Foden on the ball, it's having Cherki on the ball, it's being amazing in the final third with these wonderful creative players. And again, I'll come back to Madrid here. Instead of starting Cherki, instead of starting Foden and maybe leading into our strengths more, we started Semenyo and we started Nico O'Reilly. We started the guys who are going to give you strength out of possession in theory, because we wanted to try and strengthen that. But in doing that, we just completely shut down any chance of maybe scoring a goal with our attack. So maybe it is a case of just you should try and optimize for what you're good at and stick with that, even if it is the tactical meta or not, instead of trying to chase. Because I think as soon as you start chasing someone, you're probably not going to catch up because they're going to change. They're going to change, and you're always going to be chasing. It's like if you're playing Snake, for example, like if you're trying to catch another snake, you're never really going to do it because you're always reacting to the turns instead of being proactive. And I think the way you get or catch back up in a race where both teams are moving at the same speed is by being proactive and taking a turn, trying to predict where it's going to go instead of chasing. Because we've seen with Guardiola, if you keep chasing, you're never going to catch this guy. They've caught Guardiola by being proactive and changing the tactical meta before he could.
Yeah, and we can talk all we like about the teams that are able to play diverse tactically, and maybe the teams that are going to benefit in this new landscape. But the reality is that it's very hard to shift between tactical approaches, right? And momentum is a really important aspect of football, regardless of the tactical aspect. So if you're constantly having to tweak your teams and play different players in different games, you're losing the associative aspects of football. You're also arguably at times going to end up with teams that end up being a bit soup-like because you've got mixed too many of one type of player with another type of player. And I think that's the difficulty of it. Yeah, it's not clear to me by any stretch that it being more well-rounded as a team and a squad and a tactical outfit is necessarily better than just, as you say, leaning into one thing and being very good at it. Another thing that maybe is worth saying off the back of this is, I mean, there's been a lot of sort of head scratching about the Champions League this week because a lot of the English clubs didn't do very well, and everyone sort of finds it very funny because they say, oh, everyone makes out that the Premier League is the best league in the world, but they've struggled this week, and people are just discussing whether or not it's to do with too much intensity, too much competitiveness in the league, the amount of fixtures that Premier League sides have to play. But I do wonder whether or not, the teams who are able to dominate in the Champions League are going to be the PSGs, and they are going to be the Real Madrids and Barcelonas and the Bayerns, right, where they can pretty much play a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to a degree, or not even like a one-size-fits-all approach, but they can. So, for example, with Bayern and PSG, with their reliance on often quite extensive man-to-man approaches across the field, they're going to win leagues well enough by playing that way. They're going to match up man to man against their league better in every 1v1 duel right across the pitch. And yeah, there'll be some games that they get sort of found out by that, but they'll still have plenty enough to win the what they need to win domestically. And then when you get into the Champions League, it's almost like what we saw with the Chelsea PSG game again, where it was almost like just two teams playing, doing what they do, playing on the edge, being aggressive, and just being like, we're just going to go for it and see what happens. And I guess if you can take that kind of approach from your domestic competition into your Champions League campaign, then the players are just sort of carrying on doing what they're doing all the way through. Whereas with the Premier League sides, it almost feels like the games are so, they're so stodgy and they're so competitive that you can't really, the teams who, like, you have teams like Spurs, right, who can't buy a win in the Premier League, and then they get to the Champions League fixtures and they finish fourth in the league stage. And I think a big part of it just comes down to the fact that the Premier League sides, they're sort of having to deal with so much sort of tactical. I don't know. Maybe just the degrees between everything are just narrower in the Premier League, to the extent that when they get into the Champions League stage, they're just less well suited for the kind of matchups that they're coming in for. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. I don't think I've articulated it very well, but I just wonder with teams like Bayern and PSG in particular, where they just play their way, and they're like, we have great players, we play on the edge, we rely on our players almost, right, rather than the tactics, and say, as long as our tactical approach is functional enough, the players are going to be able to do what they do well. And we saw that with PSG in the Chelsea game.
I mean, that's kind of the reason that I don't rate Bayern Munich anywhere near as highly at the moment as the majority of other people, because I watch them in the Bundesliga, and I think these teams in the Bundesliga, maybe they're not that pragmatic. It's very, very transitional. There's lots of big spaces. Mm-hmm. And all Bayern Munich kind of do is, like you mentioned there, they just go, we'll go man to man with you kind of wherever. Our players are way better than your players everywhere across the pitch. So 19 times out of 20, we're going to win this game. Every time we play this game, we're probably going to have way more XG, way more chances, and therefore we should win these matchups. But what happens with Bayern when they come up against Arsenal, for example? They come up against a Real Madrid, a Man City, whoever they're playing, and their matchups, they're not winning those the majority across the pitch. Then I wonder what you do, especially like when your system relies quite heavily on a guy like Harry Kane, who we see consistently. He gets in the big games against a physical centre back, and you can mitigate him quite comfortably just because you can win the physical battle against him and win all the duels. So I wonder if we'll see Bayern maybe struggle in these more difficult games. I think it's interesting because we saw them play Arsenal earlier in the season, right? And Arsenal just ran them off the pitch because they won all these individual battles.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing is this a common theme, or was that a one case example where that's just happened?
Yeah, and it could just be the case that it just comes down to individual games, right? It could be that if the Arsenal players don't turn up and the Bayern players do, that's the reality. And it's, we spend a lot of time digging into the tactics and say, oh, could they have found an edge here, there, or anywhere? When it may just come down to that, right? That in that game, Arsenal versus Bayern, Arsenal won all the duels in the second half, and they came out on top in those moments. But there's nothing to say that if they played again, the opposite might be true, right? That actually the individual Bayern players have a better performances across the pitch and they come out on top. And I think maybe that's where we're going with the Champions League. Maybe it is, and that doesn't have to be the worst thing in the world, right? In many respects, there's something pure about the fact that tactics has almost completed itself, and so we just get to a position where it's like, well, all we need to do tactically is get our players into the best positions and make sure we've got our 1v1 matchups all sorted out and we prepare well for this. And then on the night, it's just a case of you go out there and win your 1v1 duels and generate what you need to. Although, I mean, at the same time, I do sort of feel a little bit conscious about just talking about man-to-man as though that's the reality of it. Whereas a team like PSG, what's so good about them is that they're so good at generating that separation in those man-to-man structures, what allows them to essentially play positionally in the old style, but it's all about timing now rather than space occupation. But I still think that's sort of relatively true, that it just kind of just might come down to the fact that the Champions League becomes a classic knockout tournament, and you have to say at the end of the day, fair play, your individuals perform better than ours, and maybe we could have found like tactical advantages here or there, but it's not a tactical failure that has led to us losing this, in the same way that it's not a tactical genius shift by your coach that's led to us winning this, right?
I almost find it the other way around. I think the Champions League is where you do get these genius moments, because you'll find this as well, is that in the content, right, we are looking for this genius moment so we can sit there and go, did you notice Pep Guardiola did this or whatever?
You got me down to a T there. I see that you've got my method all sorted out.
Yeah, but we're looking for these moments. That's what we're watching a lot of the game for. And I find they're in the Champions League much more prevalently than they are in the Premier League. I find so many Premier League games, especially this season. Like, I think there was one against Chelsea, Newcastle, which was a great example of this, where you watch it and it's like, why did Chelsea win this game? Oh, they won the duels in midfield consistently. Why did this team win this game? Oh, they won the duels. So many Premier League games, because the majority of teams are just optimizing physicality now, are literally just coming down to the duels, and there's not really an interesting narrative there. Whereas I think in the Champions League, we're seeing much more, this is more tactical. For example, Chelsea PSG, I was watching Connor Holden's video on it, just analysing what Chelsea did, and it was more PSG have done something clever with the pressing in terms of Hakimi taking up the Neves assignment rather than the Pedro Neto, and then Marquinhos taking Pedro Neto. That's the main reason why maybe they won that game.
It's the same happened in the City game with Real Madrid, right? In Valverde switching his marking responsibilities too.
Exactly.
Again, like, I guess those are like little, not like nice noticed things, but like I guess maybe I would slightly push back and just say the issue there is that you're not optimizing your system to be able to be boiled down to 1v1 matchups, right? And if a team is creating that kind of separation that allows you to get an advantage from it, all the solutions are just, well, we'll switch the marking responsibilities so that this player is less free as much, right? So it's still a sort of tactical point, but it's still boiling down to like, how is this team able to get to these duels and matchups in the first place? But yeah, point taken, I think. But I think maybe the Champions League, I agree with you that, you know, there's the possibility that there are tactical tweaks that can be made, in part because I think better players allow coaches to do more tactical tweaks, right? If a good player is often someone who you can say to them, you're doing this wrong, now you have to do this role, and they could just do it. I've talked to coaches in the past who've worked at different levels, and they've said, I mean, I've talked to a coach who was pretty high up, coaching a team. Coaching a team in the Scottish Premiership. In fact, I'll just say it was one of the old firm teams, and had also worked with Premier League players, and said the difference between old firm players and Premier League players is that you can literally just tell a Premier League player, do this, do that, do the other, and they do it. And you can't do that for old firm teams, which is, you know, that's still a very high level, right? You then take Premier League sides and you say top level Champions League sides, and essentially just coaches can sit there and say, this is where the weakness is. This is the theoretical solution. I'm going to tell the players do this, and they'll do it. So yeah, I think I agree with you in that respect, that, you know, there's the possibility for solutions to be found much easier at the highest level.
I think that's what it comes down to now in the Premier League as well, because so many of the games are just duels. They're so physical. I feel like you kind of either have to optimize to become a cup team and a Champions League team, or a league team now. I think it's going to become really rare to see sides that are successful in both. And I actually thought Man City were optimized to be a Champions League team this season. It's something I repeatedly referred to. Oh, we're going to go really far in this competition. And then we've almost been dumped out in the first game, which is unfortunate. But I'd say Arsenal are more optimized to be this league team rather than a Champions League team, because of the nature of how they set up being more conservative suits consistency, which is what you need in a league. Whereas I feel in the Champions League, you need moments, right? It's about having maybe these players with a bit of flair, a bit of freedom, finding the edge, like you keep saying. And I don't think Arsenal necessarily do that as good as someone like PSG do.
And Madrid, you know, the Madrid years where they just seem to win the Champions League all the time, they had Ancelotti, right, who is all about that, right? He's not going to care too much about, you know, complex top-down tactical solutions, and is just going to be way more concerned about getting the players playing to the best of their abilities. And, you know, there's a tactical element to that, right? Because you still have to get the players playing collectively usefully, but at the same time, that team was still able to just find the edge in those games when they wanted to. You can make the argument that, you know, Real Madrid have rarely looked worse than they have at the moment, and they've come out and biffed Man City 3-0 in a one-off game, where you can make the argument it's just the players have come out and they've been like, we're going to win this game, like one way or another, we're going to do that. We have Valverde, just not only Valverde being able to switch roles, right, and play in different positions as the team needs him to, but also in those moments stick 3 goals in, and that's the reality of elite football. And, you know, that's why elite football is great. That's why we watch elite football, and it's you know, tempting as people who care about tactics to worry about, you know, and you know, become pious about, well, you know, teams should do this or should do that. And the reality is, well, yeah, in an ideal world, but at the end of the day, these players are at the level that they're at because they can do something in a moment, and it's often those moments that are the most attractive ones to watch. And they're also that's almost the challenge, right? Is like, how do you stop these guys who are so good from scoring? How do we get our guys who are so good to do things that we didn't think were possible? And I guess that's why we love football.
Yeah, and it's because ultimately your tactical edge is in your players, right? Because elite footballers are completely unique. There isn't another Mbappe, and therefore that's where, as a coach, if you're the Real Madrid manager, for example, you know you have an edge because you have Mbappe, Vinicius Jr., and the other manager doesn't. It's not a case of you can always get the edge in the tactics, because if you play a 4-3-3 very simply, the other manager can always do that too. Like, you're not unique in that sense, but you are unique in terms of for example, on Wednesday, Real Madrid have Valverde. Valverde can do things that Bernardo Silva can't. And that's where you can find the edge in terms of maximizing these players. We see it with Man United, for example, with Amorim and Carrick. I think on a tactical level, I found Amorim way more interesting because all Carrick's really done, if we massively oversimplify it, is go, oh, Bruno Fernandes is very good. Let's give him the ball a lot. Sesko, you're good at running in behind. Let's let him do that. And then you kind of get a way more effective outcome because he's found the edge through profiling his players correctly rather than trying to find some genius tactical thing that makes the team function effectively.
Yeah, no, totally agree.
To what extent do you feel like with man-to-man presses that having a ball-playing goalkeeper is maybe more important than having an elite shot stopper? And I guess this is really relative at the moment because of the whole Donnarumma conversation, where I know which side I lie on, but it'd be interesting to see what you think.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Do you know, one of the things I've noticed recently is that like build-up has obviously changed a lot, right, in recent years. And there's very few teams now where you're consistently seeing them build up in the sort of old way, right, which is sustainable build-up. You receive it in your first line out of settled possession. You achieve settled possession. You work the ball through the lines, and then you force the opponent into the final into their own third. What I've noticed a lot of teams doing, so maybe again just the Chelsea PSG game stands out to me for this, is that we're almost just seeing teams roll the ball along their back line to a fullback and then seeing what they can do from there. And it may be the case that they're just going to go straight down the line if they're under too much pressure. It may be that they're going to try and build quickly with like the winger dropping in, the eights making themselves available, maybe a half space escape for a number 10 or something like that. But it's becoming like a lot more sort of functional in that sense. And I think the ability to be able to do that or to be able to function in that kind of system as a goalkeeper is slightly different from what we mean, right, when we talk about ball playing goalkeepers, right? So the stuff that Ederson is very good at, which I suppose that complexifies a lot of the conversation about Donnarumma, right? Because Ederson just seems like the perfect ball playing goalkeeper for the modern meta, which is that he can play long balls very accurately. And he's like fine, well, good, the sort of shorter range stuff. But like the long range stuff, I think is really useful. If you can utilize that from your goalkeeper, that's good, because, you know, what we're talking about there in this sort of new functional build-up approach is that if you have the ability to then bounce it back to your goalkeeper and the goalkeeper can get it long themselves if they're under pressure, that's a really useful outlet to have as well. But also I think that if you have the ability to be able to switch one side to the other in your build-up, so fullback to fullback, that makes you so much more dangerous against modern presses because the weak side becomes the far side. So if you can shift that ball quickly one side to the other, and you have a good ball playing goalkeeper to be able to do that in a clean manner, then I think that that's beneficial as well. So I guess the question when it comes to someone like Donnarumma is like whether or not you think that, I mean, I don't think he's particularly good at either of those things. I think people will always people use clips of Donnarumma to be like, look, he's not that bad, right? Which is him pulling off a pass, right?
Yeah, whereas he's absolutely that bad. That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I don't care about like individual examples of good passes, right? I don't think goalkeepers need to be able to do good passes necessarily in build-up. They just need to be consistent to be able to receive it on both feet and control it and get it out of their feet quickly, and then play the pass to the player that they're passing to, but in that sort of I guess people say effective way, right, or affective with an A, or empathetic way, right, where what you're thinking is where's this player going to receive it, which foot they're going to receive it on, where's the easiest place for them to do it, how can I play it to them without it becoming in danger of being intercepted by an opponent. And that's a very different kind of skill set than just this guy can occasionally make a very nice pass between the lines. You almost just want someone who is metronomic, who's just neat and tidy, does everything right all the time. the sort of thing that Rodri is like good at, right? Whereas with Rodri, you're not necessarily always looking and saying what an amazing pass this was, but what you're saying is, oh, he's received the ball in an awkward situation, got it onto his other foot, moved it out, bang, and he just never loses the ball, just metronomic, bang, bang, bang. And I think those are the kinds of goalkeepers that we may start seeing more of now. The ability to play long, but also the ability to, I think, be like almost like a 180 player. So not necessarily biased towards right or left, able to receive from both sides and shift the ball on quickly so that you're allowing that sort of functional build up to happen. So I've never really understood the Donnarumma thing, short of he's a good shot stopper and the game is becoming maybe a bit more shot stoppery, if that makes any sense. It's becoming a bit more chaotic, so therefore more shots, and it's becoming more direct, therefore more like high chance quality shots. But I also think that there's plenty of examples of him reducing the ability of City to be as functional as they might want to be in build-up.
I think there's almost infinite examples of the latter of that. Just because I think the empathetic passing thing is something really important. It's something I've talked about quite a lot this season. Just because Donnarumma looks good on a spreadsheet. He looks like a good short passer because the natural thing people will go and look at is what's this guy's short pass accuracy, for example.
Yeah. And all that means is that
he's quite decent.
The player he's played it to. Yeah, exactly. And that player's received it right in some way. Yeah.
Precisely. But I think, especially in a press, when you're under this intense man-to-man pressure, the details of that pass, or you called it the empathy of that pass, whatever term you want to use to describe it, is far more important because there's so many examples of maybe he's passing out to the right to someone like Kushnerov. Kushnerov wants to get it on his right foot so he can turn out, he can take his first touch forward and drive into the space, and then you're kind of out the press, right? But Kushnerov will receive it, it's kind of on his back foot, then he's got the ball, Donnarumma's played the pass, but Kushnerov is stood like facing the complete wrong way like that, facing his own goal line, and he can't play forwards. The opposition team will then press aggressively, and then you're in trouble. And ultimately that's because of Donnarumma, it's of the ripple effects of that pass, but it maybe doesn't show up as a direct error. And then it comes down to this thing of how can the masses digest that, I think is the main thing, because ultimately the masses control the narrative, but most people aren't going to look at what Donnarumma's doing and saying, oh, the pass he made here has had a ripple effect that then means this. People see, oh, he's made that unreal save, he must be great, and he hasn't directly lost the ball that's resulted in someone having a shot straight away, therefore he's a good ball-playing goalkeeper. But I don't think that's true. It's about having to do the simple actions really well in the details and doing that consistently, because it's got to the point now where we played Leeds 2 weeks ago or something now, I can't remember, but we weren't even trying to use Donnarumma in build-up. We were instead dropping Bernardo Silva and Rodri back into our own box to say, these are our best ball players. They will get us out of this situation, even if we don't have the overload because of the goalkeeper, even if it is completely man-to-man.
Yeah.
And I just noticed that when we have James Trafford and you have that ball-playing ability, I think we have so much more control over a game. And it's not the sexy thing. The sexy thing is Donnarumma saving something in the top corner in the last minute. But I think the more effective thing, and the thing that actually prevents more goals because you're preventing the shots by having control, is having that good ball-playing goalkeeper.
Yeah, and like I say, a big part of it for me is just the speed that you can move it from fullback to fullback. And if you are having to pass it across the goalkeeper to achieve that, or like you say, having Rodri and Bernardo Silva having to drop in and play those two roles and then have your two centre-backs wide of them, I still think you're slowing it down enough that it's like negatively impacting you. So yeah, I do agree with that. At the same time, like, I don't know, I kind of feel as though, yeah, if control isn't everything in the modern game, like, you can probably carry someone like Donnarumma to a degree. But I don't know, that then puts a huge amount of pressure on him having to be elite at the shot stopping stuff. And there's been some games recently where he hasn't, right? And then you end up being like, well, you know, nothing, what is the opposite of nothing given, nothing gained. But like, I think that's what it comes down to.
I think Donnarumma's problem again is he's great at the really difficult stuff, but often like there's saves where you think, oh, that's quite an easy one that he'll miss. He's got a big deficiency down to his right side, like a low-driven shot to his right. He almost never saves them, whereas most goalkeepers would. But yeah, it's definitely debatable, and I think we're leaning towards a ball player. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if we make that change because, like you say, you're so reliant on him coming up in those big moments when that's kind of his whole gig, especially like Real Madrid. Like we've been told consistently that, oh, this guy's here because in these big Champions League games he's going to be amazing, and then he makes a right ash of the first goal, doesn't really save anything throughout the game, gives away a penalty, saves his own penalty, which for me doesn't count for anything because you've given it away in the first place. So, yeah, I don't really see him as a massively valued asset, but I think it's interesting. Your perspective on it kind of matches up. Anyway, guys, thanks for coming on, John. Really enjoyed that conversation. I think it was quite interesting. I'm not sure many people are nerdy enough to be able to get to the end of it, but hopefully you are. If you're still here, I hope you've enjoyed it. Please hit the follow button on Spotify. Give us a little 5-star rating. We're on 5-star ratings now. We're going to be absolutely mainstream soon. So, yeah, cheers for listening.